Afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Tamika Samuels-Jones, Vice President of the Canadian Association for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, CALACS, and Director of the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean at York University, CERLAC. On behalf of CERLAC, in partnership with CALACS and the Communications and Community Committee in the Department of Politics, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Crude Power, U.S. Imperialism, and the Struggle in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are grateful that so many of you have joined us for what promises to be a timely, rigorous, and deeply consequential conversation. The events that frame today's discussion, the recent U.S. military operation to remove Nicolás Maduro, have reverberated far beyond Venezuela's borders. They raise urgent questions about the durability of state sovereignty, the limits of international law, and the enduring architecture of imperial power in the hemisphere. For scholars of the Caribbean and Latin America, these questions are not abstract. They are embedded in long historical trajectories of intervention, resource extraction, Cold War legacies, and contemporary geopolitical realignments. At CERLAC, CALACS, and the Department of Politics, we are committed to fostering research and dialogue that take these histories seriously, that center the region's political and intellectual traditions and interrogate power not only as domination, but also as resistance, negotiation, and survival. Today's conversation aligns squarely with that mandate and invites us to reflect on how intervention reshapes regional security frameworks, reconfigures diplomatic alignments across the Caribbean and Latin America, and reactivates anxieties around autonomy, post-colonial statehood, and hemispheric hierarchy. It also challenges us as scholars, students, and engaged publics to ask what forms of collective security and political solidarity remain possible in an era of resurging geopolitical competition. But before we proceed, as is important and customary, I would like to invite Luisa Isidro Herrera, PhD candidate and research associate at CERLAC, to guide us in the land acknowledgement.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Tamika, for giving the floor to me. So I would like to reflect on this land acknowledgement in relation to Toronto and the hemispheric connection. So this acknowledgement reflects on the relationship between York University and the indigenous nations of Toronto, which is known today as Toronto. More than a formal statement, it is an invitation to consider how land shapes our political reality, especially as we discuss the crude power and the complex struggles currently unfolding in Latin America, the Caribbean, and in particularly in Venezuela. Human and the more human knowledge and identity are inseparable from the land. As Audra Simpson, a well-known Mohawk scholar, suggests, land is not a commodity or a mere object of possession. It is a living medium that sustains us. For the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, the Métis Nation of Ontario, and many others who have cared for this territory for 12,000 years, sovereignty is not a status granted by a government, but a deep-rooted persistence that exists within and alongside modern borders. When we examine the theme of U.S. imperialism, we see a tension between two different views of the world. One view treats land as a resource for extraction and crude power, while the other, held by indigenous nations and many in the Venezuela diaspora, sees land as a foundation of our right to exist, to thrive, and to return. The weight of displacement is felt deeply by many in this room. By acknowledging this land, we are choosing to look past the maps of empire. We are engaging what Simpson calls as an act of refusal, refusing to see land only as a product of labor and instead recognizing it as a web of relationships. I encourage you to use this academic space to reflect on your own connection to the land. Let us consider how we can move beyond words and into a commitment to honor the integrity of the places we call home. From the Great Lakes to the shores of the Caribbean and the Andean mountain systems that has shaped our identities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louisa, for such a thoughtful and grounded land acknowledgement. We truly appreciate it. Your words set an important tone for the conversation and reminded us of the responsibilities that frame our work and our gathering. And I'm grateful for the care and intention that you brought to that moment. Now, this afternoon, we are fortunate to have with us two leading scholars whose work exemplifies sustained engagement with the political realities of the region. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers for this event, Professor Max Cameron of the University of British Columbia and Professor Antulio Rosales from York University. Professor Cameron is the current president of the Latin American Studies Association, LASA, and one of Canada's foremost scholars of democracy, authoritarianism, political regimes, and constitutionalism in Latin America. His work has shaped how we understand democratic erosion, hybrid regimes, and the institutional conditions under which democracy can be defended or dismantled. He is widely known for his research on Venezuela, as well as for his broader contributions to comparative politics and democratic theory. In the context of today's discussion, Professor Cameron brings an invaluable perspective on how external interventions intersect with internal political dynamics, how sovereignty is reinterpreted under pressure, and how democratic claims are mobilized, sometimes strategically, within contested geopolitical projects. And we're delighted to welcome him into this conversation today. Our second speaker is Professor Antulio Rosales from the Department of Social Science, Business and Society at York University and a long-standing fellow of CERLAC. Professor Rosales is a distinguished scholar of political economy, extractivism, energy, politics, and state-corporate relations in Latin America, with a particular focus on Venezuela and the global oil economy. His work critically examines how natural resources, especially petroleum, shape governance, class relations, development trajectories, and geopolitical power. In today's conversation, Professor Rosales brings a crucial lens on oil, imperial power, and the material foundations of intervention, reminding us that geopolitical struggles are never only ideological or strategic, but deeply rooted in political economic interests and extractive infrastructures. It is a privilege to have his insights anchoring this discussion. Together, Professors Cameron and Rosales' dialogue will help us think more carefully about intervention and resistance, legality and legitimacy, and the futures of sovereignty in the region. Later this afternoon, we will also be joined by Professor Tamanisha John, Assistant Professor in the Department of Politics here at York University, who will guide us through the discussion and the question and answer segment. Thank you all for joining us. I will now turn the floor over to our speakers, starting with Professor Max Cameron. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamika, for that very kind and generous introduction. It's such a pleasure to be with you, if only virtually, with CERLAC, with which I've had such a long association, such an important part of Latin American studies in Canada. It really is a pleasure, and thanks for convening us for this important conversation. I also appreciate Luisa's really moving and thoughtful land acknowledgement. I am here on the traditional ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam people. And I think it is really important to begin with that recognition in this discussion. When you think we're going to be talking a little bit about the Monroe Doctrine, for example, and if we think about the Monroe Doctrine back in the 19th century, it was both anti-colonial and pro-Republican, but it was partly a manifesto in defense of the project of settler colonialism. So there are extraordinarily complicated interrelationships among all of these forces that we're going to be talking about today. So I really do look forward to that. I look forward to this discussion, and particularly to be in conversation with and Tulio is such a good friend for now several years, and whose work I admire enormously. And thanks also to Camila Boniface for the logistics of this. I want to begin just by noting that the organizers of this event also did a really good job of responding very quickly to a concern about the initial flyer that went out that gave us a map of Venezuela that unfortunately and unintentionally included some Guyanese territory. And I really appreciate you responding quickly. I didn't recognize that immediately, but it was pointed out to me. And when I noted this, I really am grateful to you for quickly changing that. We all need to be mindful of the sensitivities that an issue such as this raises, and people in the Caribbean often feel that they are excluded from these conversations, or not their role is not sufficiently acknowledged. And the dispute between Venezuela and Guyana is one of the very few territorial disputes that exists in Latin America. It is a zone of relative peace, which is important also to acknowledge in the context of this conversation, because of course the U.S. intervention in Venezuela is the first attack on South American soil in 200 years, as President Lula of Brazil has noted. And I also want to say that thank you, Tamika, for mentioning that I've done work on Venezuela over the course of at least 25 years and have acknowledged and written about the erosion of democracy in Venezuela, which I think begins under the Chavez governments, but then really accelerates under Maduro. And particularly by around 2015 and clearly by 2017 and onward, Venezuela is governed by an authoritarian regime that has repressed its people, has inflicted unimaginable and painful harm on the population, has created a humanitarian disaster, has led millions of people to leave the country, searching for better fortune elsewhere, and which holds power by virtue of the most blatant fraud, I think, that we have ever seen in Latin America, and that's the elections of 2024. So I think we can be quite clear that in speaking as I will today, often quite critically of U.S. foreign policy and of intervention in Venezuela, that doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge the cruelty and the repressiveness of the Maduro dictatorship. But I want to begin with something else. I want to start with the extraordinary document called the National Security Strategy that the United States government issued back in December, which outlines the U.S. orientation toward Latin America, and announces, in effect, the Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, a return to this 19th century idea that the Western Hemisphere is part of the sphere of influence of the United States, and that the United States has the authority to dominate countries throughout the Western Hemisphere. And by the way, although Canada is scarcely mentioned in that document, the Trump's attempt to take Greenland suggests that it is aimed at Canadians as well. And as I read that document, I recall thinking, this is just an extraordinary statement and reorientation of American foreign policy and return to earlier days of imperialism. I wonder what this actually means in practice. And of course, the answer came very quickly on January the 3rd, when the United States, having assembled an armada off the coast of Venezuela, attacked and abducted Nicolás Maduro and his wife and brought them back to New York to be put on trial on charges, among other things, of drug trafficking. Now, this event brought with it a number of, quite remarkable surprises, I would say. I mean, the first surprise to me was that you would assemble the level of military capability that was placed in the region, enter into the country over 150 jets and helicopters and a bombing of strategic points around the country, and particularly around the installation where Maduro was, to enter in, killing dozens of people, including many Cubans, in order to detain Nicolas Maduro and bring him back to New York. The event itself was not a surprise. I mean, you don't assemble that kind of military force and not use it for some purpose, but to use it to detain a single individual and that person's spouse struck me as quite extraordinary. It's got to have been the most expensive arrest in the history of humanity. And so that's really the first big surprise, is that this was not an attempt at regime change. In that sense, we can say that the Trump administration could have been taken at its word when it said it was not interested in regime change and was not going to invade Venezuela. What happened in some ways looked more like a coup than an invasion, although it was an act of aggression by one country against another, unprovoked, and thus a violation of the UN Charter that prohibits this. But it was ostensibly for the detention of a single individual and did not bring about, at least in the immediate term, a change in the political regime in Venezuela. Instead, and this to me, I guess, was the second surprise, the government of the United States felt that it could work with the vice president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, left the regime in place, installed, in effect, the vice president as the acting president to replace Maduro, and then, claimed we're going to run the country. So we are running the country. Running the country, essentially, I suppose, by holding the threat of invasion like a sort of Damocles over the government, to ensure that it does the bidding of the United States. Things like controlling the export of energy, and then now it appears that with the quarantine of certain energy resources, there will be resources that go into Qatar that then get distributed by the U.S. partly to Venezuela, presumably partly some of it is kept. The Trump administration saying that it wants to rebuild the energy system in Venezuela. I'll leave it to Antulio to speak more to that. He's got more expertise in that area than I do, but I think it was a kind of an extraordinary admission. I mean, Trump is the guy who says the quiet part out loud, and for him to say we're in it because we want our oil resources that have been taken by Venezuela from the United States, again, also quite extraordinary. So we have then a series really of sort of puzzles about what exactly is going on and how do we interpret and understand this. And I guess I think that there are sort of four things that we can point to, or that have been noted by commentators looking at these events, that seem to have been significant in terms of trying to explain what's going on. Oh, sorry. One other factor that I'll add, and this is related to the decision to work with Delcy Rodriguez, and that was the decision to throw Maria Corina Machado under the bus, in effect to say she doesn't have the respect of the authority to run the government in Venezuela. At first, I thought that comment was a little bit by Trump, a kind of a remarkable statement. I mean, she is without question the most popular opposition politician in Venezuela, won primary elections by an overwhelming number of votes, and would have won the election in 2024 had she not been barred from running. And that barring of candidates from running from election is a very significant violation of a fundamental democratic right. She threw her support behind Edmundo Gonzalez, who then won handily according to the opposition counts of votes. And since the government has never produced credible results, I think we can go with what the opposition said, which was that they won that election very, very handily. So you would have expected that Maria Corina Machado just won the Nobel Peace Prize, putting aside Trump's churlishness about not getting the prize himself. She has now, of course, given it to him, and he seems to think that means that he's been awarded the Nobel Prize. But that the not centering Maria Corina Machado in the Democratic opposition in the context of this struck me as somewhat surprising. Though now we have reporting from the Wall Street Journal that suggests that this is largely a function of the decision by the U.S. administration on the advice of the CIA that an attempt to change the regime quickly would produce instability, and that is not a mistake. I think that's probably quite right. That is to say, this is a regime that has installed itself, entrenched itself. It has control over the armed forces. It also has a set of allies in civil society, some armed, such quasi-autonomous. It is in a position to make the country ungovernable, and so the decision has been to work with the regime that's in place. Now, how long that lasts, what kind of transition might be imagined in the future, we're beginning to get hints about that from Marco Rubio's testimony in Congress the other day. But it's pretty vague, pretty uncertain, pretty hard to know what this is going to look like. Back to the question then of what explains all of this. Well, I think I'm going to highlight four things, and then I'm going to mention a fifth thing that I think is important to kind of put it all into context. So, one factor would be drugs, right? I mean, there's no question that the Trump administration has made drug interdiction, stopping drugs entering the United States, a priority. Prior to the intervention in Venezuela, the United States was bombing small boats and submarine running drugs off the coast of Venezuela and Colombia and Mexico. It appears that Marco Rubio made the case to Trump, and that may be why the intervention happened, in part that Rubio was able to persuade Trump that this could be justified as an attempt at drug interdiction and enforcement. So again, part of the spurious argument that's being made about how this isn't an act of war is, well, all we're doing is arresting somebody who's been indicted on drug trafficking charges and is not a president because he's only in office by virtue of fraud. That is not an argument that holds water. That is an argument that it doesn't comport with international law. But it is part of the justification that the Trump administration has given, and it's probably in part how it justifies its actions to itself. But I think we have to remember, Venezuela is not a major drug producer. Colombia is far more important. It is perhaps a transshipment point, but even there, I mean, in terms of fentanyl, it's inconsequential. We're talking largely about cocaine, much of which goes, in fact, to other places like Europe. And the idea that Maduro was the head of a narcotics cartel, the Cartel de los Soles, is really quite it's noticeable. It's remarkable that in the accusations against Maduro in court, those arguments have been soft pedaled because, frankly, the truth of the matter is there's a lot of corruption in the Venezuelan government, and undoubtedly some of it's connected to drug trafficking, some is connected to illegal gold mining and cryptocurrency. And again, Antulio can speak more to that than I could. But the idea that you are taking in Maduro and you're decapitating a drug cartel and now your drug problem is going to go away, that's complete and utter nonsense, right? Nonetheless, it may figure in terms of the thinking of some administration officials. Oil is the second factor. Now, again, I have trouble understanding oil as a justification for intervention. Apparently, there are CEOs of the oil companies visiting Venezuela today, and the Trump administration has insisted it wants $100 billion to rebuild the oil industry and sees this potentially as some kind of potential revenue source for Venezuela and for the United States. But that, I think, will take years to come online. There's long, substantial investments that have to be made to turn around the Venezuelan oil industry in a time frame that far exceeds the tenure in office of Donald Trump. And I can't see foreign investors, lining up to put money into Venezuela, given the uncertainty around the political situation at this point. But nonetheless, oil is clearly a factor. Cuba, I think, is another factor. Then there's no question that Marco Rubio has had his eyes on Cuba his entire political career, would like to bring about regime change in Cuba, sees this as an opportunity to strangle further Cuba, to tighten the embargo, to prevent oil from going to Cuba, and would like to see regime change there in the near future, and sees Cuba as vulnerable in this moment. I think that's a very important factor. I think that may be part of the end game. And in fact, if you look at sort of the right-wing think tanks in Washington, they talk about keeping China out of the hemisphere, cracking down on these anti-American governments in Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, and then worrying about sort of broader leftist influence throughout the region. So I think that's another factor. And then the final factor I would point to, this is Rachel Maddow's point, that essentially Trump is intoxicated by power. He likes personal power. He likes to exercise power. He likes the gratification that comes from the perception of having extraordinary personal power. And so to be able to oversee these kinds of operations, he liked bombing Iran. He likes intervening in Venezuela. I think that's also an important consideration. But I want to bring in another factor, which I think is absolutely crucial and which helps to put the others into the appropriate context. And that is the so-called Donbrow Doctrine. That is this national security strategy that the United States has outlined, which basically says the U.S. is no longer interested in maintaining the international rules-based order, wants to have less of a role in Europe, doesn't want to be involved in forever wars, wants to focus on U.S. interests and sees the Western Hemisphere as a vital part of its interest, whether it is in ensuring stability in the proximate neighborhood, whether it is preventing mass migration from countries in the region into the United States, whether it is preventing drugs from entering the U.S. and fighting drug cartels, whether it is preventing rivals, particularly China, which has seen massive growth in its trade with Latin America. And that commodities trade, frankly, has been a big part of what has supported progressive governments in the region. And in fact, trade between Latin America and China is expected to grow. It may eclipse the United States within the next decade. It already is the largest trading partner for a number of countries in the region, like Brazil and Chile, for example. And the Chinese have invested very heavily in infrastructure and ports and rail and roads and so forth. And that's going to continue to foster trade. The United States also wants access to resources, critical minerals, oil and gas, and other natural resources. And so there's a sort of return to this idea of a world in which major powers have spheres of influence which they keep others out of. Russia, this part of Trump's sort of lack of interest, really, in resolving the war in Ukraine to the benefit of Ukraine. His frank attachment, or his tendency to seem to view with considerable sympathy the posture of Vladimir Putin, I think comes from that sense that this is a Putin problem. The United States shouldn't have to deal with this. Likewise, I suspect he. I don't want to speculate about Taiwan, but I think he sees China as it has its sphere of influence. but we want to keep it out of the Western hemisphere. And so this goes back to the Monroe Doctrine, to this idea that the United States has the right to interfere in defense of its own interests. And interestingly enough, there's very little in the national security strategy about democracy. Democracy scarcely figures. In fact, to the degree that it's largely mentioned in the context of complaints about how Europe is losing its civilizational integrity. I mean, and I think that that lack of interest in democracy is, of course, a reflection of the fact that Trump is in no way a Democrat himself. I mean, there has been a stunning process of rapid democratic backsliding in the United States. I don't think that we can. I disagree with scholars who would say it is an authoritarian regime. It remains a democracy as long as there's alternation in power between government and opposition. And I think we still have every reason to believe that as Trump accumulates errors and mistakes and overreaches and does crazy things, that in fact the tide of public opinion can turn against him, and that can be exploited by the opposition. And so I'm not pessimistic about the prospect of the preservation of at least electoral democracy, but it is absolutely clear that this is a much degraded, much eroded, much more defective democracy. It is a crisis of the republic. In many respects, it's more of Republican backsliding, to use a term Alberto Vergara has coined. It is the erosion of separation of powers. It is the erosion of the rule of law. It is the erosion of fundamental rights and freedoms that are necessary for a community to be self-governing. And it is the concentration of power in the hands of politicians and the concentration of economic power, and those two things working hand in glove, which is turning the United States into what is clearly a quasi-oligarchical regime. It's a democracy with very strong oligarchical features. So I'm running toward the end of my time, I suspect. And so let me maybe conclude with a few implications. And I can't not but speak to what all of this means for Canada and for all of us in the rest of the world observing these dynamics. In the first place, I think that this means, our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has stated very, very clearly and very eloquently that the rules-based international order can no longer be counted on to protect the interests of the smaller players, of middle powers and smaller countries. Now, interestingly enough, that's a lesson the Latin Americans, I think, learned many, many years ago, and it is not a surprise to them. I think to the extent that one could actually say that Carney's speech in Davos could well have been given by Brazil or by South Africa or by many countries in the global South. If there's a gap between rhetoric and reality in terms of how the international rules-based order has functioned, that's been clear to Latin America for many, many years. And it is one of the reasons why Latin American countries have been hesitant to intervene in the dispute between Ukraine and Russia. That is perceived as this is an example of where, when it's in Europe, those principles are upheld. When it's in the global South, they're not. Why is it, for example, that the UK, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the UK, was so muted in his reaction to what happened in Venezuela and so very much firmer on Greenland? Why is it that the Europeans got all tied up in pretzels over Greenland, and so many of them didn't really speak out with respect to Venezuela? Well, the answer is obvious. The Europeans want American support, US support in Ukraine in defense against Russia. And the fear is, if you alienate the United States for things it does elsewhere in the world, you're not going to get its support in this struggle, which is a good deal closer to home. Thinking about the Latin American reaction to what has happened, we did see strongly, I would say, I feel, strong, principled, coherent statements of defense of sovereign equality, of non-intervention, of the international rule of law by countries in Latin America like Uruguay, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and Spain, right? Joint communique by all of these countries, um, notably all progressive governments. Uh, the countries that welcome American intervention, U.S. intervention in Venezuela, of course, Milei in Argentina, who has benefited from a bailout from the United States, so he knows what side of his bread, how his bread is buttered. Jose Antonio Cast, the president-elect in Chile, the right-wing president-elect in Chile. Bukele, and so forth. So conservative, Noboa in Ecuador, conservative governments have been more inclined to welcome this and to see it as a step toward the liberation of Venezuela. Um, I just want to say parenthetically, because one of the things that you often hear from Venezuelans outside Venezuela, as well as some inside Venezuela, opposed to the Maduro regime, we don't really care about the international rule of law. This had to be done. It's a step in the right direction. We support it. I think that it's important that we remind ourselves that principles of sovereign equality, non-intervention, peaceful resolution of disputes, these are principles that have been upheld by Latin American governments for for decades and decades, if not centuries. These are principles that serve governments of left and right. And it is the mistake of the dilettante to think that you can sort of pardon abuses of this sort because they happen to serve your partisan preferences. That's how you get into trouble, I think. And I think that the Venezuelan opposition frequently has played into this, has made this mistake, playing into the hands of seeking outside support to solve the domestic problems. It's understandable. This government has been under Maduro incredibly recalcitrant. Yes, it has played those who have sought to bring about a peaceful resolution. Yes, it has done so. But that doesn't mean that you abandon those fundamental principles of the rule of law and of the international system. Or if you do, there is a price to be paid for that, which may not be so obvious in the short run. For Canada, I think that historically, Canadians have not seen ourselves as being targets of the Monroe Doctrine. Partly that's because the Monroe Doctrine came after the United States lost the war with Britain. The consequence of that was that John Quincy Adams, who wrote the speech that was delivered to Congress by President James Monroe, said to the British at the time, keep what you've got, leave the rest to us. So the attitude of the United States has long been, okay, we acknowledge the reality that Britain has a place in North America. We will try to not dispute that, although it was disputed with the Oregon boundary dispute. The truth is that over the course of history, the U.S. has on repeated occasions attempted to encourage provinces to leave Canada and join the U.S. There's never been a firm understanding of our sovereignty until really the end of the Second World War. And then we have been part of the Transatlantic Alliance. We've been part of NATO and NORAD. Canada and the United States have had the longest undefended border. We've persuaded ourselves that we would never be at risk of American interference in our sovereignty, of U.S. Designs on our sovereign independence. Trump has changed that. And we cannot assume that the United States will, in fact, it's not that we can't assume, we have to assume that the United States will seek to undermine our sovereignty, will seek to divide us, will seek to polarize us, will use deep integration, will weaponize integration to facilitate this, including using platforms that are controlled by the United States that we cannot regulate, we can't even tax, to try to undermine and divide us, to try to promote, for example, the movement for independence in Alberta as a way of weakening Canada to facilitate their domination of the Western Hemisphere. The attack on Greenland, the threats to Greenland, the threats to Canadian sovereignty are of a piece. And I think that we need, as a country, to acknowledge that that's the new reality we live in. We're no longer operating in the context that we have become accustomed to, the sort of, in a way, comfortable position of thinking that as long as we are friends with the United States, we can count on our prosperity and our security. And we have to fight for those things ourselves. And that means mobilizing resources internally. It means diversifying our trade. It means finding other allies, working with other powers, and not falling into the trap, which Carney so clearly identified, of sort of competing with one another to seek favor from Washington. We have to cultivate alternatives. We have to be prepared to walk away. And there will be a cost to that. I think I'll end there. I think I've used up my time. I'm happy to pass the floor over now to Antulio.
Thank you so much. And thanks, of course, to CERLAC and CALACS for organizing this, as well as the Communications Committee and the Politics Department. I want to echo what Max early on said about both the organizers, Camila, Luisa, Tamika, and Tamanisha. Thanks for getting us together to have this conversation. So I really appreciate the invitation. And I have to say, of course, that I am very honored to share the space with Max, whom I've admired for a very long time, and who has has accompanied my career in a distance since I just was in my undergrad. So it is a pleasure to be here with him and with you all. I just want to say that I agree to a large degree with the analysis that Max has just shared. So I've taken some notes that I want to converse with you about, and I will try to edit myself to not repeat too much of what Max has already said, but try to complement some things and perhaps differ in a few, but try to bring a slightly different perspective as well. So what I will try to do is try to first also understand, try to explain a little bit how we got here, also from the perspective of the different actors within Venezuela and around Venezuela. And how can we explain this kind of this dramatic end, or not end, but breaking point in on January 3rd, 2026, from the perspectives of those different groups internally and around Venezuela. Then go back to the U.S., but I won't delve too much because I agree with what Max has kind of explained already about the different motivations that explain the U.S. intervention. But I will add a couple of things there, and I will end with oil and basically kind of delve more into the dynamics of the oil industry and how it seems to be playing out currently. So on January 3rd, I guess, like many Venezuelans, uh, I woke up to this news, and of course, while we were not fully surprised, because as Max was saying, you don't assemble that kind of an armada in the Caribbean if you're not intending to actually use it. So we were not fully surprised, but certainly I felt a sense of deep frustration and disappointment with ourselves as a society, with Venezuelans. I mean, it reflected on what I've been thinking of the past month as a failure, as a cumulative set of failures of different actors that in part reflect a collective failure of our own. And that is kind of the first part of what I would like to share with you. Um, it is, on one hand, a failure of the Maduro regime, clearly, and I definitely uh, share what Max was explaining. I mean, the most significant of these failures is, of course, uh, uh, July 28th, 2024. I mean, the inability of the Maduro regime to face the fact, to understand the desire and respect the desire of the Venezuelan people to choose their own future and to elect their own government that is not one held by Maduro and his political party is a major failure. But even after that failure, the possibility of engaging in honest negotiations with other sectors of Venezuelan society is a quite dramatic one. And and really, for a long time, the Venezuelan government led by Nicolás Maduro did not take negotiations very seriously, and they would usually buy time with them. But at this point, I think it was a critical moment in history when it was an opportunity to actually change course in this regard and engage in minimal acceptance of the fact that they don't hold water anymore and they could have thought about um, an off-ramp, and they refused to do so. And they relied on repression, crude repression that amounted to thousands of political prisoners and kind of doubling down on some economic measures to sustain and cement their own power. So that is the side of the Venezuelan government. And there's another underlying failure there that I have to mention that is kind of explains a little bit the result of what happened on January 3rd. And it is also within the Venezuelan government is a failure of the Venezuelan military, which was ostensibly potentially penetrated by the United States and the CIA, which meant that there was not much of a reaction. But even if it wasn't fully penetrated in the kind of the classical sense, it was incapable of defending Venezuelan territory and sovereignty, and it was incapable of doing so. And many analysts in the military arena has have given us some clues as to why. I mean, the Venezuelan regime has been so obsessed with coup-proofing the military that it was kind of almost logistically incapable of acting as a military and to protect those air defenses that were knocked down within minutes, right? And other things. So that's just a failure within a failure on the side of the government. Then it is very clear that the Venezuelan opposition has a share amount of failures too. And we, of course, understand the fact that they've been heavily repressed and marginalized internally, many of whom, a lot of them have been, especially surrounding the entourage of Maria Corina Machado, have been imprisoned, and the numbers are many, and both not only in Caracas and the top barras of her movement, but also local leaders, community leaders in various parts of Venezuela, and then of course civilians and protesters and so on have also been imprisoned. But the point is that we understand that the Venezuelan opposition, I understand that the Venezuelan opposition has been heavily repressed and marginalized, and that has pushed a reading of the Venezuelan opposition that I think is largely mistaken, and that leads to the second major failure. That is, the Venezuelan opposition has surrendered its own agency to mobilize change from July 2024. And actually, after that remarkable organization to protect the tally sheets and to kind of voice and prove the electoral fraud, they have kind of entrenched themselves in the idea that they can surrender that agency and instead seek another external actor to do the change for them. And it is in part explained by forced migration and the fact that they've been exiled and expatriated and so on, but in part because of a belief of the elite of this political movement that is an expedited way, and that is actually the only way. That is what they've thought, and they've been proven wrong, at least thus far. And to kind of engage in a transition. So they've even provided the justification. So a lot of the justifications that Max was just explaining before, drugs, oil, I mean, all of these things were even given rhetorically by Maria Corina Machado and others, right? Saying that, the United States needed to act with force because of hemispheric security, because of the drug trafficking, and actually trying to justify this idea, this spurious idea that I'm not going to go into, because I think that Max described it really well, of the carteles de los soles, the cartels of the sun, and that Nicolás Maduro was the head of this drug cartel. And so they provided this, and at the end of the day, when you lack this agency, when you have the capacity to leverage movement inside the country, but also give up to this foreign leadership, you end up in a very precarious condition, like she is currently, like the opposition is currently, right? They're thrown under the bus, and they are trying to tow around, keeping some form of relevance. There's a third failure that is around Venezuela rather than Venezuela itself. And it is different actors in Latin America, right? I mean, um, right after the election of 2024, Colombia and Brazil, the Colombian and the Brazilian president attempted initially. I mean, first also with the Mexican president, but there was a transition, a change of government at that point, and that kind of wind down, and there was no interest clearly in the AMLO administration, the Sheinbaum administration, to do anything really about Venezuela, and they were really honest about it. At least they were clear. Um, but both the Colombian president and the Brazilian president, as neighbors and kind of bigger powers in the region around Venezuela, took it upon themselves to promote a form of negotiation, and they really oversold what they could do. The potential influence that they had on Maduro, the levers were not really used. They were not really coordinated amongst themselves. You could hear or you could read Gustavo Petro's, Colombia's president's tweets, and they were not in line with what Celso Amorim, who is the main advisor for foreign policy to Lula da Silva in Brazil, were kind of suggesting. So there was a major failure in Latin America. That's what I'm getting at, and that is also a concerning point, because I agree with Max. I mean, many of these progressive governments have then denounced the violation of international law, but it is also a point of self-reflection that needs to take place onto, what they could have done differently to put Maduro on the table, to actually force him into different incentives to relax both his regime and the possibility of allowing a democratic transition. And then we see that the United States has all of these justifications, and I'm not going to go into them because I think that Max has explained them very clearly. And I would add just one more, and it is tied with this movement of backsliding and undermining of the rule of law internally in the United States. It has to do with migration and this obsession with mass deportations within the U.S. and the identification of Venezuelan migrants as an important target for that. So I think that is another kind of rhetorical justification for this action. And there was a moment in the disputes between the presidency and the courts in the U.S. where the United States the government was using the Aliens Act, that basically many in the legal community said you cannot really use that because you're not at war with Venezuela. So there is also kind of a strategic ambiguity with what is being done with Venezuela. I mean, they're saying constantly that it is not an act of war because this is more um, uh, of a capturing of a right to capture a criminal. But in any case, this ambiguity, I think, is been useful for at least some in the U.S. administration to go further in this kind of xenophobic and anti-migrant attitude, right? So that's another justification there. But clearly, the United States, what I'm trying to get at, has put itself at the center of what's going on in Venezuela. I mean, this is no longer, I mean, for many years, both government and opposition would try to say this is something for us to fix. And even if the opposition was calling the US to come in and intervene, that ultimately we would have to think about our problem as only our own, and try not to map onto the kind of the U.S. politics onto Venezuela's reality. And I think that that is no longer feasible, right? The United States is right at the center of what Venezuela is about to happen in the future, and it is a major decision maker, sorry. And what these failures end up producing is that we have, on the one hand, a government that is led by Delcy Rodriguez, her brother, and a few others who control the levers of power internally, who have a very difficult dance to play, right? It is both trying to keep unity within its regime, which is something that they identify as crucial for survival. They've known this forever, even if they dislike one another. They've clearly identified that they need to be united in order to survive. Um, but now they know also that they need to give up enough to the United States in order to sway any potential threats coming from outside without fully giving up, at least rhetorically, that they are a tutelage, a regime that is being under tutelage by the United States. So it is a very complicated dance that they have to dance, right? And they're doing so. They're threading that needle, and I will try to explain that a little bit when I get to the oil part. But the consequence of that is that Venezuelans are lost, right? I mean, this is between Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, Delcy Rodriguez, her brother, and others, right? Again, the decision-making ideas and logics are centered on these individuals and not on Venezuelan society. And the opposition also has to thread the very same needle. So they seek to remain relevant both to the United States, and that is what the past couple days visits of Maria Corina Machado um, kind of refer to, is to maintain her relevance and try to push for the three phases that Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been promoting. That eventually this tutelage will lead to a transition where they would be benefited. But of course, there's no guarantee of that. There's no timeline, and every time it has been mentioned, Marco Rubio has been very clear, or has been very clear about how vague he is in terms of of when that could ever happen. The point is that they're losing relevance internally, right? They're less articulated with people domestic, and I agree that most people in Venezuela definitely prefer the opposition, and Maria Corina Machado remains a popular figure, but there is no organic relation in terms of organizing social resistance, the possibility of really building a democratic movement internally with the leadership of the Venezuelan opposition. At least that is currently strained, and it has to be rebuilt. And of course, it has to recognize the diversity of Venezuelan society and not just what the current leadership of the opposition sees as ideal. And that is, they've always had some trouble with that. There's always been some um, challenges, even when they managed to gather 70% of the vote. That was the last time they could articulate a movement like that, and they just need to get back to that point. But now to just get to the second part of what I wanted to talk about is um, when we place the United States at the center, we realize that when they speak of being in control of Venezuela, um, of course, at first, Donald Trump suggested that this meant, they would be in charge of the day-to-day of what's happening there. And that basically these people behind him, when he was giving that press conference, there would be, the viceroys, the governors of a new territory that was being recently acquired. And that is not fully the case. And we know that Delcy Rodriguez is trying to manage some autonomy vis-a-vis the Donald Trump administration, and particularly the Ministry of Interior, who manages the repressive apparatus of the country, tries to speak a big word about autonomy and things like that. But clearly, where control seems to be happening and where the tutelage is more clear is on the economy and especially on oil. And I have to be very clear about this, is that uh, the level of crisis of the Venezuelan oil industry is certainly unprecedented for a petrostate. So the Venezuelan oil industry has been decimated in terms of investments for more than a decade. And on top of that, the economic crisis that pushed millions of Venezuelans out of the country, especially pushed out medium skilled and unskilled workers that were part of the industry. So people who could no longer live on a wage that were paid by oil companies in the country left. And then on top of it, we have abandoned infrastructure that has been sold in parts by people who were literally stealing pieces of metal. So there is the degree of decay that we see in this industry. For a major petrostate, it is quite dramatic. So the level of investments that are required to recover this industry is quite substantial. It's not something to laugh about. And and there is here, interestingly, a unsuspected agreement uh, amongst the Venezuelan political elite, both in government and in the opposition, that these kind of investments must come from abroad. Venezuela doesn't have the capacity to do that on their own, and um, and in fact, especially within the Venezuelan government, and this is what people may be surprised about because of the very anti-imperialist rhetoric that the government has had for a long time. In fact, the government actually led by Delcy Rodriguez in particular, and I will explain why. Uh, she is very much in agreement that there needs to be deep changes to the legal framework, to the oil industry, and and she welcomes new investments coming from the United States. So that part of the tutelage is very interesting because um, it comes at a perfect time. It is actually, as we say in Spanish, it fits como anillo al dedo, right? It's just a perfect fitting for what Delcy Rodriguez and the architects of the Venezuelan liberalization, targeted liberalization, that has happened in the past 7 years were dreaming of. The possibility of actually forcing a change in the legal framework, and they were not able to do that for many reasons, and particularly for the image of and the memory of Venezuela's identity as a resource nationalist and a petrostate that had pride on that, and particularly the memory of Hugo Chavez played an important role there. So what they did is that they did some stealth um, reforms, and they made some secret agreements, secret contracts that were allowed under a anti-blockade law that was very unconstitutional actually in practice. And they made some illegal arrangements. Now what they're doing is taking this moment as an opportunity to legalize all of these old arrangements and to completely remake the framework of the oil industry. And I will just explain just really quickly what this is all about and have some points about the implications for Venezuela's democracy, and which is, let me say, very important because Venezuela's democracy or the potential for Venezuela's democracy has long been tied to the possibility of the country owning and making not only exercising ownership but sovereignty over its natural resources and the rents deriving from the underground. And that is what has been tested in history, right? So what are the changes? So, right after January 3rd, one of the first announcements that Delcy Rodriguez made was in a meeting with the National Assembly president, who is her brother. They announced the desire to change Venezuela's deep legal frameworks that were necessary for a new awakening of the country. And the very first law that they thought it needed to be changed and reformed was the organic or the constitutional law of hydrocarbons. And I'm not surprised about that because that is the message that Donald Trump sent immediately in his own press conference. We will take care of the oil and we will control the oil industry, which will be a new awakening also for America's companies, for American companies. So uh, just a week ago, they had crafted a first reform of the law, and within hours, they didn't even debate it much. They approved the first round of discussion, and this is currently in its second discussion happening at the moment at the plenary of the parliament. And as we are talking right now, and right before I connected, I was trying to see the changes. So, and they changed it in a week's time. They changed it even farther. And what are some of the most important changes that happened to the hydrocarbons law? Uh, they have to do with one, dramatically lowering tax burdens, clearly royalties in particular, but also unifying different forms of taxes that would kind of lower the burden for investors. Um, giving up operational control. Up until now, in theory, the Venezuelan oil company needed to have operational control over any joint ventures. Now, there could be other kinds of contracts, including production sharing agreements, as well as joint ventures, but they're giving up operational control to the foreign operator or the national capital operator, and admitting to the possibility of external arbitration, which is something that also was contradicted to the previous law. But I think what is most important, and this will tie with with my assessment of the future of Venezuelan democracy, is that this new law or the reform of the law does away with any potential oversight from Venezuela's parliament for the elected officials of Venezuelan institutions. It gives complete discretionary power to the executive, which, if I remind you, is in conversation with a foreign power about how to direct investments and how to use the proceeds from oil sales. In a way, this is an illegitimate government that first came to power through fraud and then through a foreign intervention, and currently is deciding the future of Venezuela's resources with that foreign power. So completely sealing away and closing out to the Venezuelan parliament and Venezuelan society is a very serious issue for the future. And what it tells us is that this money the proceeds of the oil that will come and be deposited in account in Qatar, will then be approved according to what Trump and Marco Rubio have said, would approve budgets that the interim government will pass on to them. So they will say, we need to buy certain things, and that is our budget. So we will have no national oversight and transparency around that. This is remarkable for so many reasons, but I will tie it back quickly to the history of Venezuelan management over oil. Um, this cannot be compared, but just to the dictator Juan Vicente Gomez of early 20th century, not even the later dictatorships or the transitional governments afterwards, and of course not to the Venezuelan democracy, where any changes to Venezuelan investment schemes or tax frameworks or any transformation of the Venezuelan oil industry went under deep scrutiny. And I'm not saying that it was perfect. It was never perfect. And but have been books written about uh, you know uh, different declarations in Congress and in the Venezuelan parliament when Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso in 1943, when for the first time the Venezuelan government reached the agreement of 50-50 distribution of proceeds with companies, he voted no, and he gave a speech that lasted a long time. And there have been theories written about this, and the emergence of OPEC came after that speech, with the 5 points of the petroleum pentagon that he came up with. So we're going to miss all of that. There is no discussion in Parliament about joint ventures, about new contracts. These are agreed between the executive power of the Venezuelan government and the United States. And Delcy Rodriguez has been the architect of the transformation of the Venezuelan economy, leading to these different discrete openings of market elements. And the roadblock had been the oil industry. This was what was missing. And I think she's content, and the Venezuelan government is content with the idea of doing this in order to welcome new investments. And it's very important that if we think about solidarity and anti-imperialist mobilization, um, what we have to really push for is to bring back Venezuelans to the question, to draw our solidarity to what Venezuelans want, and try to be humble about what Venezuelans want, even if we may disagree with them, how they want to use the resources that are extracted from their territory. Also, have solidarity over Venezuelan migrants whose rights may be undermined in the United States and are undermined by the Venezuelan government later on when they're received after being expelled from the US. So I think that is very important to think about solidarity in those terms. And also one of the things that will be missing, are missing currently, is, a question for Venezuelan society about, how do they conceive the recovery of the Venezuelan oil industry in a time of climate change? Um, what is this good for, and why would we want to go around this down this path? It is a big question that is not being asked to Venezuelan social forces, and it is one that is pending. And any uh, space for solidarity and space for discussion that is open up should have this at the forefront, I believe. So I will leave it there, and I'll just welcome your comments and questions. Thank you.
Okay, hello. First, I would like to say thank you both for your presentation, Max and Antulio. And now we have reached what I would call the sort of end of the lecturing type of phase of the program, and more towards the, discussion and questions phase of the program. So first, I will pose two questions or points to think about, and then also hopefully there's time to pull two questions from the audience, and there is time, and we do have two questions in queue. So I'll go through my questions first, points of discussion, and then also read the audience questions. And I think what I will do is I will read my questions first and then the audience questions, since it will give you both time to reflect and think about the questions before providing your responses to them. The first thing that I want to mention that I don't think has been discussed today yet is how intervention, especially intervention that violates a state's sovereignty, breeds intense nationalism in any country that the intervention occurs in. And so that is also true for Venezuela. It's that as people bear witness to things like bombs, they tend to want to rally around their government and their state. And so in Venezuela, we have even now see that some in the opposition that are still in the country, not outside in diaspora, are calling for unity with President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, First Lady Celia Flores, who were kidnapped after the bombings, aiding the wider calls for unity by the acting president. And so it's not just that the Trump administration is working with the Maduro government and the Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who is acting as president, but also within Venezuela, wider calls for unity are being taken seriously, especially because Trump and his administration's calls for continued use of force has not dissipated. And there's still that sort of armada built up in the region. And I think that this question of nationalism in the aftermath of such a blatant violation is important to at least discuss, given the lack of what Antulio pointed out as a lack of democratic movement on behalf of the opposition. And instead, what I would call, we have seen a reinvigorated two-pronged democracy in Venezuela that extends beyond the first kind, which is the normal parliamentarian elections kind that was spoken about a lot today. And then, although spoken about briefly, but to a much lesser extent, the kind that goes down to the assemblies or the communes that have been empowered with weapons in the aftermath of the kidnapping, and what Antulio called that first failure of the military attack by the US. And the sort of US military attack on Venezuela would have always been an asymmetrical one, just given US military capabilities in comparison to many countries in the world. And so I guess that my first point of reflection is how intervention breeds nationalism, especially in Venezuela. The second thing that I want to mention is how rhetoric encourages US intervention, not just in Venezuela, but also in other countries more broadly. For instance, today we have not heard sanctions discussed, but also there was time spent to talk about the sort of opposition insights into the 2024 elections without mention of observers that were also there in Venezuela in 2024. And this sort of was acknowledged yesterday as a slippery slope by Rand Paul during Rubio's hearing, where he noted that Bolsonaro said that Lula isn't the president of Brazil, and prior to his current term, Trump claimed that Joe Biden didn't win the elections. So, if nowhere else we would verify or take as fact what an opposition says without a wider apparatus to back that, why would we then do that for Venezuela, which again provides a rhetorical justification for a gross sovereignty violation? And I think that this bears witness because, as Max mentioned earlier, when talking about the court case against Maduro and how they sort of downplay or underplay now that he's this big drug cartel mandate, the language used in that indictment was humanitarian intervention language. And so they say that they had to kidnap President Maduro to protect indigenous communities due to mining in Venezuela, to protect those millions of people in poverty in Venezuela, and also to defend those Venezuelans that have been forced to migrate or imprisoned in countries like the US because of the suppression and oppression of Venezuela. And so all of these were things that we know that the Venezuelan opposition have said. And so if on the one hand there is this acknowledgement that securitization language and rhetoric have aided this external intervention that then breeds nationalistic impulses, what is the dangers of completely taking as fact what is claimed by, the US or even by opposition figures like Machado when it comes to sovereignty violations? And so it seems that both of my questions or points of discussion are related to each other, as they essentially talk about the dangers of adopting US securitization language when it comes to sovereignty and how the consequences of those, yes, includes the military action, but the sort of aftermath of military action, which is intense nationalism. And so now it would be even harder to align oneself as against, the government or against any of these things because of the reality of, bombs being dropped. And so those would be my sort of two, questions or points of contention. And then I will read now the two questions that are in the chat so that you all can reflect on that as well. The first question is from an anonymous attendee, and it says, the Dunroe Doctrine does not exist, nor does the Gulf of America, unless Dr. Cameron has agreed to participate in the lawless order led by Trump think. To note, I don't think that I've heard anyone say the Gulf of America tonight, but that I just want to point that out. And then they said it is dangerous to suggest that term is acceptable. Would you wish to advise us on the use of this term? So I'm not sure if the term is just Dunroe Doctrine in general or if it's the Gulf of America, but that is one question. And then the second question by Wilder Robles, who is a guest, says, in Latin America, especially South America, a new reality has emerged. China has gained substantial economic influence, and the US is unlikely to reverse this trend. As such, the Monroe or Dunroe Doctrine is mere political illusion by President Trump. And so I guess to sort of connect those two questions as I'm reading them, they're again talking about sort of the potency or the strength of the Dunroe Doctrine to combating Chinese influence in the region and whether or not us maybe using that term sort of participates in the lawlessness by Donald Trump. I guess after reading those questions, one question that I will ask Dr. Cameron is that you pointed out in the national security strategy, this sort of focus on the Western Hemisphere and Trump's goal to sort of industrialize in some way, which would be untenable given the fact that he only has about 3 years left in the presidency. Something else that has been said in the national security document is that the US wants to sort of bring back some sort of industrialization to itself. And people have pointed out that the US has not made those substantial investments in industrializing its country for many, many years now. And I'm wondering then if it sort of pretends that it has this foothold in the Western Hemisphere, whether or not it would then assume or think it can assume control over other states' industries to sort of integrate it into that sort of US industrialization process and make it a hemispheric goal, maybe led by US corporations or something. And so I will mute myself and I look forward to the discussion. Hopefully you have enough time to think about these questions, and I'll let you both decide which order you want to go on.
Antulio, how do you want to do this?
You go first and I go second. Let's keep
Okay,
that.
sure. All right, so let me first of all go to the first question. The Dunroe Doctrine does not exist, nor does the Gulf of America. By the way, I do agree. It is the Gulf of Mexico. It's not the Gulf of America. I didn't say it was the Gulf of America. I don't think anybody did here today. Unless Dr. Cameron has agreed to participate in the lawless order led by Trump, I don't know how you would interpret anything that I said as encouraging participation in Trump's lawlessness. It would be dangerous to suggest that the term is acceptable. Would I advise the use of the term? I think that questioner didn't appear to get the gist of my presentation. And I note that it's an anonymous attendee. And so it's quite common in this era of social media for people to make comments hiding behind anonymity, which are often divisive or intended to be provocative, but which actually don't facilitate a kind of meaningful, thoughtful exchange. And so I think that I'll say nothing more about this other than that the idea that the joke that there's a Dunroe doctrine. I think it comes from the New York Post that put that on one of its headlines, and it was picked up by Trump. And people have used that term. That's all it is. I think that the thrust of my comments with respect to the Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, call it if you will, the Dunroe Doctrine. I think my arguments were clear, and I'm sorry that this person misunderstood them. Let me then go to the sort of Rand Paul comments to Marco Rubio. He was saying to Rubio that to say that removing a sitting head of state because you accuse that person of having won fraudulently is a slippery slope when you are part of an administration that says that the last president of the United States stole the election. So I think it was pointing out the hypocrisy in Trump's use of electoral denialism. There's no question that there was massive fraud. I think that's very clear. In the case of Venezuela in 2024, there was not massive fraud in the US election in 2020. These are established facts. I think there were something like 60 legal, there were 60 efforts through the courts to try to challenge the results of the 2020 election, none of which prospered. There has never been presented compelling evidence of electoral fraud in the United States. It is a big lie that Trump has used to insist that those who are part of his administration bow before him and accept an untruth in the full knowledge that it's an untruth as a way of asserting power. That's very different from from the situation of Venezuela, where there's overwhelming evidence that there was, in fact, electoral fraud. So I think what's important here is to understand that electoral denialism is part of democratic backsliding. It's a recourse. It's a weapon that's used by autocrats or people who are opposed to the functioning of democracy to try to undermine democratic institutions. And upholding those principles and the way to defend democratic institutions is to ensure that there are independent electoral authorities who are credible. And if governments politicize what are intended to be neutral or impartial judicial institutions that have the function of counting votes and determining the outcome of elections, they invite suspicion and doubts about the legitimacy of those governments. That's why it is so vitally important to respect those institutions. And that's true in the United States or Canada. It's true in Venezuela or elsewhere in Latin America. And one of the reasons why it's important to be able to establish that governments have the legitimacy of origin of having been elected is because that is a critical element of popular sovereignty. Republican governments are based on the notion that the people are sovereign, and popular sovereignty is not identical with state sovereignty. Countries have a legitimate democratic countries may have a legitimate preference in working with other democracies. And that means that if you live in a country that respects popular sovereignty, then you may prefer to work with other countries that respect popular sovereignty. That's why we might prefer to work with Europe rather than China. That's why we might prefer to work with Colombia rather than Venezuela. That doesn't give us the right to overthrow countries that have violated popular sovereignty. That's not necessarily the best solution, right? And so in Latin America and in the Western Hemisphere, over the course of the last 25, 26 years since the adoption of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, there has been a struggle over the extent to which we adhere to the principle of sovereign state equality versus at the same time balancing that against also understanding that sovereignty is reinforced to the extent that it is based on popular sovereignty. Let me put it to you in counterfactual terms. Imagine Venezuela today was a fully democratic, a functioning democratic regime. U.S. intervention in Venezuela, were it a functioning democratic regime, is unthinkable. So it is the failure to uphold democratic principles in Venezuela. This doesn't mean that Venezuelans are responsible for U.S. intervention, but the failure to uphold democratic principles made that regime vulnerable. And I think it is actually kind of fascinating, as I think on Tulio's point, that the regime spent so much time coup-proofing itself. It didn't anticipate the possibility that there would be a coup engineered by the U.S. government, because that is, in some sense, exactly what we've seen. Now, think about the regimes in Latin America today that are not electoral democracies. Primarily Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. We could also have a conversation about El Salvador, but let's leave that to the side for a minute. What is the shared characteristic of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela? I would argue that all of these dictatorships have, in different ways, but in ways that are quite clear, roots in the Cold War. Cuba is the product of the Cold War. It is the product of the changes that happened in Latin America after the overthrow of the Arbenz government in Guatemala, persuaded Cuban dissidents that there was no possibility of change except by means of armed struggle. Nicaragua, again, the Sandinistas came to power in the context of the Cold War against a repressive dictatorship that was upheld for many decades by the United States. In the case of Venezuela, it's a little bit more complicated because there was never a successful guerrilla movement in Venezuela. There was a guerrilla movement, it was quickly wiped out. And one of the consequences of that was that revolutionary socialists in Venezuela chose the strategy of infiltration of the armed forces. And Chavez attempted to take power in 1992 during the Cold War. In 1992, or just after the Cold War, by means of a coup, and then was detained and then ran for office. But he brought to governance a kind of Cold War mentality. His goal was to prevent a coup like the one that happened in Chile in 1973. And that's why we have 2,000 generals in the Venezuelan military. They have made sure that the military is not the source of regime change in Venezuela. But the vision of politics has always been a hegemonic one. There's never been a commitment to the underlying principle of pluralism, that democracy involves rotation between government and opposition. It has always been a hegemonic project. So I think that in many respects, these three regimes show us the risks that we take when we engage in the kind of politics that was typical of the Cold War. So back to the point about the effects of interventionism. Yes, I actually agree. U.S. intervention and U.S. Um, taking, and I loved Antulio's remark about how the United States has now positioned itself at the center of the situation in Venezuela. It will be held accountable for what happens in Venezuela. It is, if you claim to run the country, you're going to be held responsible for what happens there. And it is entirely possible that the United States has put itself in a position in which we could imagine 10, 20, 30 years down the road, there will be forces within Venezuelan politics that will be absolutely antagonistic to US intervention and that will have a nationalist ethos that will be anti-imperialistic because that is the history, right, of imperialism. Is imperialism provokes nationalism, and nationalism that takes the form of anti-imperialism is very commonplace in Latin America. But we were getting in Latin America away from that. We were getting to a point where it was beginning to be possible for governments of the left to come to power by strictly democratic means, to govern democratically, to be replaced by opposition, have the right come back to power, and then return to power. And even Colombia has had then a left-wing government. This has happened in Brazil. It has happened in Chile. It's happened, even Guatemala has had the election of a more progressive democratic government, although it's had a good deal of difficulty actually governing. We're at risk of losing that. We're at risk of going back to a world where the kind of Cold War thinking of it's communists who are the enemy that have to be destroyed, right, by any means possible, which inspires people on the left to think that the only way that you can take power is by means of armed struggle. And so they either go underground or make common cause with sort of radical populist nationalists who might come to power, as was, say, the case in Mexico. We could return to that kind of cycle of politics, which is deeply corrosive to democracy. I hope that doesn't happen, but I think that is one of the dangers of the kind of politics that we're seeing reemerging in the hemisphere under this Trump's Monroe Doctrine and its corollary. Antulio, over to you.
Great, thanks. Thank you to Manisha for those questions and for the audience as well. I will organize my answers to try to tackle a few things. I think the question about breeding nationalist sentiments is one that I take seriously because I studied resource nationalism um, and I've been following Venezuelan politics for all my life. But I would phrase it slightly differently. I think that the most central concern that I hear both from people anecdotally, but also from the evidence, the crude evidence of elections, is not just the allegations of individuals and leaders, but actual evidence is that what is motivating Venezuelan society currently, and could be read as a form of nationalism in the sense of self-determination, is that Venezuelans want to decide their future. And that is the galvanizing cry of the majority of Venezuelans currently. They want to be able to choose their own government. And that is a form of national identity and national organizing and national mobilizing. So despite the fact that we may personally agree or disagree with those who lead those movements, I think we should be humble enough to encounter that evidence and recognize it and accept it. I think it is, I would invite everyone to think about this humbly in the sense of this is what people actually want. And they've said it in many different ways. So this is not an allegation that Machado has made. Actually, there is physical proof of tally sheets that have been confirmed with QR codes that are printed out that the Venezuelan military actually managed to allow people to get, and that can be contrasted. Like us as social scientists, we know that we can contrast evidence between one copy and the other. Many PSV, which is government party activists, also contrasted those tally sheets. And when the government decided to force these people either into prison or to not share those tally sheets, those were completely disappeared. But the one that's why we have the ones from the opposition, because when the militants of the PSOE were showing the tally sheets, what happened was that they were confirming what we had already, and the government has refused to show the other copies, which is something that it has historically done. So every time there was only allegations and they were empty allegations, and I would have been the first one to say those were empty allegations. You called for fraud, it was not true, and the Qatar Center said that was not true in 2004, and the Qatar Center said in 2024 it is actually true. We saw the tally sheets. So it is not just an allegation. So it is just proof of evidence, right? And around that, there is a rallying cry of the Venezuelan people to choose their own future. So that is just kind of what breeds nationalism and that kind of feeling of solidarity. There is, of course, a base of the Venezuelan government that finds some support. I mean, 30% of the population voted for Nicolás Maduro. Uh, and they have rallied around Delcy Rodriguez. I'm what I'm still thinking is it is a very tough position to be in for those who support that government. It's a very tough position because um, it is very difficult to support a government while at the same time keep a anti-imperialist movement around a government that is being um, directed from the United States, right? So it is very difficult, I think, to thread the needle of asking the US to return Celia Flores and Nicolás Maduro back to Venezuela, and at the same time make the actual reforms and changes that the US is seeking and wanting to get and receiving, continue to receive the migrants every Tuesday and Thursday in flights that come from Texas. So I think it is very difficult to thread that needle, even for those internally who may not have access to other sources of news and media, etc. But for us here, I think it may be easy for us to reconcile that contradiction and to see the problems there. I mean, it's not too complicated, I believe. Now, I will try to lead to the point of China and the oil industry, but also to tie it with sanctions, because Tamanisha is absolutely right. Sanctions are important, and I've always disagreed with the idea that the U.S. is not part of our conversation. What I say now is that we cannot evade it anymore. But in part because of sanctions, the U.S. was also always part of this conversation, right? And sanctions. Uh, General sanctions, economic sanctions, that started in 2017, first with the barring from purchasing bonds and renewing debt from the Venezuelan government and the oil industry, and later on in 2019, when it was barred from selling oil to its own subsidiary in the United States. Indeed, that affected the oil industry, which was already quite decimated. So Venezuela was already declining in its production capacity, and already Venezuela's debt was highly quote unquote toxic, according to the term of Francisco Rodriguez. So it was already very difficult for Venezuela to acquire bonds, but it was just definitely just became impossible later on. And part of my research, demonstrates that in fact the sanctions made things worse, right? And sanctions affected the economy that was already in free fall, right? So we see that up until 2017 there was dramatic contraction, there was high scarcity, high inflation, hyperinflation, and things just worsened from there and kind of forced transformations within the political regime. Um, but just to answer the question of China, at least in the case of Venezuela, and I understand that China has many different interests in the hemisphere, but I think that the Chinese behavior in Venezuela would suggest the caution that I believe China will have in the future. And if not fully, completely abide and adhere by the idea of spheres of influence, they may be persuaded by the possibility of actually extending their power somewhere in East Asia and allowing this changes over there in Latin America. What I'm trying to say here is that China, at that moment of increased sanctions and inability for Venezuela to access, for the Venezuelan government to access debt and from Wall Street and so on, China retreated. China had already been retreating from Venezuela, and it didn't want to pick a fight with the U.S., but it also was not interested in really saving the Venezuelan government. It thought, based on the research that I've been making and the interviews I've had, it thought that it was a bad investment, that the Venezuelan government was not very serious about some of the things that they had agreed to. And so it retreated, and it was fine with just getting, a trickling in of oil as payback for the debt that they had. So I do think that China wants to get a return on their investments. They want to get a return from things that they're owed. But I don't see China moving on aggressively to kind of cement their influence in the Western Hemisphere, if that would mean kind of a direct confrontation with the United States, at least militarily, uh, because of their business interests and other things, right? So it's not what I'm saying here is not that like the new, let's call it Monroe Doctrine with the Trump color rally is necessarily successful in a reality. What I'm saying is I agree with Max in the sense that this is just the desire of the United States and it turning policy, and of course it will find challenges, but it could. Maybe this is the first demonstration of where they want to go with that changing policy. Thank you.
Thank you both. We've since gotten 5 or 6 questions now, and I know that we won't be able to answer all of them. We have about 18 minutes left, so maybe if I read the questions quickly, you all could choose which questions and which parts of them you want to answer, and I will read the order that they've been sent in, or at least try to. Okay, yes, I can read the order that they're sent in. The first question is from a guest, Matthew Trinkus, and they say, when thinking about the recent tranches of elections in the region, thinking of the result in Honduras, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, etc., what are your thoughts with respect to the threats of repercussions by the Trump administration, sometimes through direct tweets or posts on Truth Social by the president, to citizens voting in favor of progressive or non-aligned candidates as their heads of state? The second question is from Aziz Al-Adil, and they ask, to your point about how Trump views each major country is concerned with its own hemisphere, how do you believe Latin American countries will operate going forward, since it's apparent that the Trump administration is willing to do military operations within the continent, especially countries that have Chinese trade partnerships? There's already been comments about the Trump administration violating Mexico's sovereignty with the justification of confronting drug cartels. The third question is from Lisa North. Hi, Lisa. Will people start returning to Venezuela? Super simple question. And then over on this side, question for Dr. Cameron. I'm very interested in the distinction and connection you draw between US intervention and a coup. This stands out to me because the international narrative has often focused more on the aspect of foreign intervention than simply calling it a coup. Given that many countries in the international community explicitly condemn the misuse of international norms in this case, could you elaborate on why you chose to decouple the coup from the framework of US intervention? Second, a question for Dr. Antulio. At the end of your presentation, you reflected on how Venezuelans conceive of themselves in their relationship to oil amidst an environmental crisis. In that same vein, I would like to ask, how do Venezuelans view themselves in the midst of the current democratic crisis, including human rights? And those 2 questions are from Luisa, who's also on this panel, and I'll ask Luisa's last question, a question for both speakers. You have both highlighted the influence of US imperialism on domestic politics in South America. Colombia is Venezuela's neighbor and has historically been a steadfast US ally, known for its North Star foreign policy. However, Colombia is facing elections this year where one of the strongest political forces is left-leaning. What implications does this election have for the region and for Colombia specifically, especially given its close proximity to Venezuela? And the final question, posed by Clifton Grant, asks, Thank you for the engaging conversation. It is beyond enlightening, and the contemporary relevance of our discussion makes it even more impactful. As two Latin American scholars, can you both further extrapolate the I think it means convoluted and complex relationship in the entanglement between Venezuela, US, and Cuba, and how the capture of Maduro has on the contemporary and futuristic socioeconomic and politic future of Cuba? Can you compare and contrast the American political ideology towards both countries? And maybe I've read them so slow, but I think that you both have about 7 minutes to answer those questions. And as it regards Clifton Grant's question that was posed lastly, both of you may have seen or may have known that Cuba has been in a state of war for over a week now. So it has also chosen to arm its population, going back to what Max was speaking about when answering my question about the sort of incoming nationalist sentiments of armed struggle in the region again. Thank you. 7 minutes each, and you get to decide.
Okay. You want to start first this time, Antilia, or do you want me to?
Sure, I can go for it for just really briefly. Just to, of course, I will choose first the easiest question from Lisa because that's very straightforward. And uh, the Venezuelans that are returning currently, most significantly, are the ones that are being expelled by the United States by the hundreds every week, right? And there are others coming from the US that are quote unquote self-deporting because of the conditions they're going through and the undermining of rights in the US and the use of very violent tactics by ICE and others. Um, there are other Venezuelans who have returned from other parts of the world, especially when the new president of Chile was elected. There was quite a big movement in the border between Chile and Peru, and so we may see some of that is forced by circumstances, but I don't see clearly a move of the Venezuelan diaspora to go back happily and willingly to the conditions that the country is currently in. More so, they would be going because of um, because of forced conditions rather, right? So that would be my kind of my straightforward question, and I will have to think a bit more about some of these other ones. Um, Let me see. Do you want to go? Oh,
Mhm.
yeah, I have
Sure.
Luisa's. Yeah. Yeah, the issue of Colombia is, I think, is very important. I think Donald Trump was very bullish about his view of President Gustavo Petro, and they had kind of a little bit of a conversation, and they seem to have been happy about it at the end. However, it is, as Max is clearly pointing out, this is a dangerous time for anybody in the region. Of course, the proximity of Colombia for Colombians, I think, is very serious in the sense that there have been kinetic attacks happening on speedboats in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and so and we don't know. I mean, there is no proof of activities or illegal activities happening to those who have been attacked, and there is very weak sort of legal justification for these attacks happening. So I think that is very serious, and but I don't see a a determination from the United States to topple a Colombian president. I think it is rather more focused on the Cuba side of the story, and of course Nicaragua as well. But 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 certainly Cuba, where I think Marco Rubio has a personal connection to, and I think that currently I see Marco Rubio really charting this action in Venezuela and potentially future actions in Cuba uh, as um, as his platform for the candidacy to replace to to be the candidate and later on the president, the candidate of the Republican Party, and later on the president. So I think it is cautious. It would be more worrying in the case of Cuba than in the case of Colombia. And just to wrap up and finish, um, the relationship between the Cuban and the Venezuelan elite seems to have been strained, and there is was just one tweet coming from President Diaz-Canel saying that he had held a conversation with Delcy Rodriguez. In a way, his tweet was much less enthusiastic actually than what Trump has said about her, and that kind of suggest quite a few things right off the bat. And that I think is, and I'm sorry to intrude into your answer, Max, but that is what I think is interesting about the idea of a coup, right? I mean, clearly there was a foreign intervention that violates international law. That is, I mean, there's no doubt about it, and Max has been clear about it, and I totally agree. But there's a component of a the toppling of the leader of a regime and the replacement, um, uh, his replacement by the vice president in steadfast communication with the foreign aggressor. So with very little resistance from the military, by the way, and long-term conversations happening with the brother of this person and the representatives of the United States. So I think that is extremely, it is important to consider that that is if there is no direct proof of treason, at least of communication and cooperation, certainly there is. I mean, there is absolutely proof of that, and that is, I think, what the point is about the coup thing. And finally, very quickly, the idea of how do we see ourselves in vis-a-vis the democratic crisis and including human rights. I think this is a major call for Venezuelans. I mean, and I think it's very important to highlight just one thing. There is in Venezuela around 1,000 political prisoners, but over the past 9 years, there have been a total of 18,000 political prisoners, including people who have died under the custody of the state for various reasons, including horrendous torture that led to their death. Others have died for medical conditions and so on. I will highlight one thing about this. Um, Several years ago, those who were political prisoners and people from intellectuals on the left outside Venezuela would point out that these were merely, leaders of the bourgeois opposition, and usually consider them as traitors and so on. They still have rights that had been violated, but I just want to make something very clear. Political prisoners today represent the wide diversity of the Venezuelan population. There are former Chavista ministers who are imprisoned. There are former Chavista leaders, community leaders, women and men. And most importantly, there are children who are imprisoned or who have been imprisoned since July last year. Minors who were either protesting, who were also sometimes just outside when a protest was happening. And the vast majority of these people are young, poor, brown, and black Venezuelans whose mothers, sisters, and fathers are currently in a vigil that has remained in place the entire month of January, waiting for them to be released. People who have not been able to see their children who are imprisoned. So Venezuelans currently, I would say there is no other uniting cause at the moment than the plight of the political prisoners right now and the plight of their families outside those prisons. And what I'm trying to say here is that it goes all the way from the top attorney of Maria Corina Machado, Perkins Rocha, all the way down to teenagers in Portuguesa state in the plains of Venezuela who are captive of this government. So it is very important. It is a central question for Venezuelans and a central question for unity and for potential reconciliation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Antulia. That's an incredibly important point. And I just want to go back to the earlier discussion of the sort of was it a coup or was it an invasion? And so, if I were to say to you, imagine a country. I'm not going to tell you the name of the country or the name of the leaders, but there's a country where the military comes in and takes the president in his pajamas and spirits him into exile in another country, and then installs the vice president and says the vice president must do our bidding. We would call that a coup. That is a coup. That's what coups look like. It happens that way all the time. The coup in Honduras, for example, the coup in Uruguay in the 70s. Uh, Often it's the vice president who winds up holding office and then has to do what actually even Peru recently when Castillo was removed. That wasn't a coup, but the vice president wound up in office. The difference here is that the agent is the U.S. military. We've never seen a coup in Latin America conducted by the U.S. military. Um, but if but apart from that fact, it otherwise looks very much like a coup. And the thing that's interesting about this then is you ask yourself, was there collusion? We know that there were conversations ongoing between Rubio and Trump and the U.S. administration people and the Venezuelans. Maduro was part of those conversations right up until a day or two before the actual intervention. And we know that Delcy Rodriguez was involved in those conversations. There has been some speculation that this was collusion, that there was a kind of a nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We'll give you Maduro and we will comply with your dictates because that's actually going to help our regime to survive maybe long enough for people who have enriched themselves to make their exit, or maybe it's because we actually hope to prevail, to persist over time. We don't have evidence, and it's extremely unlikely that Delcy Rodriguez knew about the military operation Absolute Resolve. That's unlikely because it would have been very unwise to share that kind of information. But Delcy Rodriguez may have had some intuition that this was happening. And as you pointed out, Antonio, and I agree with you on this, there's every reason to believe that Delcy Rodriguez, while a true believer, a true Chavista, nonetheless is a pragmatist in many respects, has a working relationship with the business community, and has wanted reform in the energy sector for years and has made that known. And so, in a way, this provides the cover for her to do what she wanted to do anyway, and maybe would have found very difficult to do with Maduro in power. And then add a third element, which I think, Antulia, you've sort of hinted at, and that's the Cuban connection. Is it possible that that one of the desirable features of this situation, from the point of view of Delcy Rodriguez and her brother, is eclipse the wings of the Cubans, who are so important within the security apparatus within Venezuela? That's pure speculation, but it doesn't seem unreasonable. And I do think that the big part of the story is about Cuba and is about a desire for regime change in Cuba. And I think that they probably expect that in the near term. I'm going to go just quickly to Mexico. If you look at Trump's pre-election promises, he talks about a naval blockade of the cartels and the use of both covert and overt military force against the cartels in Mexico. When I heard that, when I first saw his video in which he says this, my jaw dropped. I didn't know, is this even possible? Well, after what we have seen in Venezuela and with the new national security strategy, that does not seem entirely implausible to me. We're only in the first year of this government. There's 3 years to come. I would watch very closely what the U.S. government has planned for Mexico. And then I'll make just this one final point because we really are out of time. I think the point about Trump's threats and how that could dampen the interest in voting for progressive candidates. And certainly he's helped Milei. He's tried to help Bolsonaro. He's certainly helped Bukele. I think Bukele is the bigger influence in the region than Trump. But Trump and Bukele, Bolsonaro, Cast, there is a kind of a right-wing international at work here. That said, look at the effect that Trump has had in Canada. His demand for Canada to become the 51st state produced exactly the opposite response, which was a strong wave of nationalism and indignation on the part of Canadians. So I worry in some sense a little bit less about his tweets. I worry more about the weaponization of the platforms and the way in which we have surrendered our digital sovereignty to broligarchs, to the tech bros, to Twitter, Facebook, Meta, Alphabet, these big corporations, which now are so able to shape the discourse within countries around the world, often in ways that are profoundly undemocratic. I think I'll have to stop there because I do see we are really at the top of the hour.
Yes, thank you so much. We have reached the 6 p.m. mark. Thank you to everyone attending this CERLAC event that is co-sponsored by the CCC Committee and the Department of Politics. I encourage you all to join CERLAC list and visit the CERLAC website to see future events planned in CERLAC. Thank you so much, both for the conversation, for everyone who asked questions, and I will see you all at a different event in CERLAC.